Deadline day dashes and a disappointing defeat for Norwich City, all in the space of 24 hectic hours for the Canaries. It was obviously deadline day on Friday, defeat to Rotherham on Saturday, and Norwich left it uncharacteristically late to get some business done in the window, and then suffered what was a defeat that felt a bit like a hangover of some kind of description, particularly that first half display. We're going to get into all of the various strands concerning Norwich City and the last few days that has been. I'm Connor Southwell, joined by Paddy Davitt, who, despite late interest in the transfer market, has remained with us, which is
from no one, Connor. Said no one.
Well, my other plan was to say that you were sat in a car park like Peter Rodham Wingy somewhere. So I think I went for the one that was a bit more flattering to you.
Thank you.
That's all right. That's all right.
Even though it's rooted in fanciful notions of interest from elsewhere, but yeah, no. Sadly, I'm going for the. Let me think of somebody suitably longevity. I'm going for the Wes route. I'm going for my testimonial, mate.
Nice. Okay, yeah, I was going to try and think of a footballer that I would be, but I don't think it works, to be honest. But you can have Wes. We'll let you have Wes. That's fine. I think I don't know. Maybe Adam Drury, just reliable and dependable.
Yeah. I was going to say, sorry, you're breaking up a little bit there, Connor. More in terms of his longevity than any actual ability or talent, I might add. But anyway, let's move on. Let's swiftly move on to more exciting matters or more enjoyable matters, not which was Rotherham, but there you go. Can't win them all.
Yes, let's start with Rotherham, Norwich City's first league defeat of the season. Paddy, it was a defeat really where Norwich City were beaten by themselves in the first half. A really poor performance. They got caught on the chin by a very good Rotherham side who performed very, very well. But it was interesting to hear David Wagner and Angus Gunn both say at the end of the game that they kind of felt it was their shortcomings rather than perhaps the game plan that Rotherham inflicted on them that was the reason for this defeat. Do you concur with those assessments that both Wagner and Gunn made in the wake of that 2-1 defeat?
I would. We were there, obviously, and the benchmarking of what had gone before, particularly in league games, to what we saw in that first half, it was don't want to over catastrophize because it is one defeat in 7, and that is a very, very good start still. But there was far too many echoes of the throwback to last season. Not all of last season under Wagner, because he only came in January, but certainly when it started to go south post Millwall, to really have anything that would trouble opponents. And there was far too much of that in the first half, definitely. And that was quite a sobering 45 minutes, really, from a Norwich persuasion. It did get better, and they got the early goal in the second half. But even then, I thought after probably 10 or 15 minutes post Bashnak's lifeline, it sort of unravelled again, and then you ended up with pretty poor in terms of quality into the box from both wide areas, and trying to look for Ashley Barnes and later Shane Duffy, which was, not going to get the job done and didn't get the job done. I don't think you could dispute Rotherham deserved it over the 90 minutes. They were just better and able to impose what they were trying to do onto Norwich, and conversely, Norwich were very lackluster, essentially. And it was actually good. I mean, you spoke to Angus and I spoke to David, and it was good that close proximity to the final whistle that he had processed it, and he had already broken it down, David Wagner, and really pinpointed it. He talked about tactically there was some issues in terms of too many players coming towards the ball rather than trying to stretch the play. And of course, that immediately you think about the whole dimension of Josh Sargent unavailable yesterday, but more problematically until January now, the confirmation that he's having surgery on Monday, going to be Christmas/January before we see him again competitively in a Norwich shirt. So they've got this period of time and a lot of games between now and then that they're going to have to unpick that tactical element of what Sargent was giving them alongside Barnes, what he isn't going to be giving them for the foreseeable, and how they solve that issue. But also there was a sense from David and the robustness and the energy associated with him and what he's trying to do, but certainly what we've seen in these first 6-7 weeks of the season. You didn't know the energy and intensity and the fire and the aggressiveness were all for the majority of the first half, and Norwich just got themselves pinned inside their own defensive third. They didn't seem to be able to find a way through in any residual fashion. Yeah, there was 1 or 2 moments of promise, but even then, they were sloppy in possession when there was counters and transitions there for them. They lacked precision in what they were trying to do, and it was better in the second half, but over the entirety, as David said, and I think Angus said, and they'd clearly discussed this internally before they emerged from that dressing room, it felt like a reality check. It felt like, don't turn up and take anything for granted. What's gone before doesn't help you in the here and now. And if they needed to learn that, then hopefully they will have learned that. And they've got, as David said, really 2 weeks now to sort of linger on it, which he feels might actually be a positive. That that hurt and that disappointment, they will have to sit and suffer that for a little period. If they would go rolling straight into a game this coming Tuesday or this coming Wednesday, then you package it, you park it, you move on. But it might not be the worst thing that that feeling in the pit of the stomach really is going to linger a little bit, and that they don't want that moving forward. And David Wagner certainly said that defeat, in his opinion, was a defeat that they inflicted almost on themselves. It was through their shortcomings and their failings and what they didn't do, and the standards and the level they'd hit consistently up to this point. They fell below. So for him, with those rooted in their shortcomings, then he will make it quite clear that isn't going to be the case moving forward. So it's almost like he'll give them that strike, I think, as a group, but he does, and also those supporters as well, because it did feel a corner had been turned, and that was, for me, that first half particularly was a throwback to where a lot of the frustration came from the last 11 games of last season, where you were watching a Norwich team in the Championship, in and out of possession, who were lacking the ideas, lacking the creativity, lacking the energy and the thrust to impose themselves on opponents. It was the other way around, and we saw that very definitely in the first half, particularly at Rotherham. And when you felt that was associated with the past under Wagner, it was a little bit of a throwback. But as I say, and we'll probably refer to this point liberally through this podcast, context is everything, and it's one defeat in 7 games, and it shouldn't outweigh by any stretch all the huge positive work that has been done, both in terms of results but also performances as well. So I think we just need to retain a healthy degree of perspective, but you can't hide away from what we saw in the first half wasn't acceptable.
Yeah, agreed. And I was stood there listening to Angus Gunn speak and to David Wagner speak, and did feel it kind of felt like they were being quite harsh on themselves, but maybe that's a reflection of the standards that they've set, because as poor as they were in that first half, and they were very poor, and we'll get into the reasons why, and you've kind of named perhaps the primary reason, they still went pretty close to getting a result. They weren't a million miles away. If their final ball would have been a little bit better, if they'd had a bit more quality, maybe even, dare I say, a little bit more depth in the squad that they carried to Rotherham, they may well still have walked away with a point. And the second half performance was better. They dropped Sarah back into a deeper position. They got him on the ball a little bit more. And because they weren't necessarily stretching the game in the same way they have done in recent weeks, that helped create a bit more space centrally. Rotherham had to go and press Gabriel, was struggling to go and press Gabriel Sarah in the same way. And so it created a bit more space centrally. And in the end, we saw Rotherham move to a back three, which did kind of help them to an extent. But that was as a result of the changes that Norwich City made at half time. So we did see a reaction. But for me, you've identified the real core reason why that first half was such a struggle, because we saw it at Huddersfield, and it's very simplistic, I think. Josh Sargent's not there. Therefore, if Josh Sargent would have been dropped into this, they would have won the game. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think it was more a nuanced point of what we've seen in recent games is, yes, with Josh Sargent, but also with others as well, Norwich would stretch the game. There'd be runs in beyond. And what that does is not just give options for defenders and deeper lying players to clip a ball over the top to relieve pressure and get you up the pitch, but also because you're dragging defenders with you, it creates space centrally. And they didn't do either of those things. So Rotherham were able just to kind of park in Norwich's half in a fairly high block. It wasn't even necessarily a really good sustained press. It was just a real solid block of pressure that they placed in Norwich's half and said, go on then, play through us. And Norwich ultimately were unable to do that, both because of the way Rotherham deployed it, but also because of their own quality. But I guess that kind of lack of impact in behind, which I know David Wagner spoke about, and we noticed actually in the first half throughout the game. I don't know, where are you at with that, Pad? Is that reflective of the duo that was up front? Is that an attacking issue more broadly? It did seem a problem for him, didn't it? Particularly in that first half of that game, there wasn't the same energy or enthusiasm or hunger to get in behind and really make those runs that stretch the game, but also create space for Norwich City's midfielders to get on the ball in deeper areas.
Yeah, well, the two facets you've sort of mapped out there, Connor, is I think you bring them together. Yeah, of course, you take Sargent out of that team. The goals, 3 goals in the last 3 or his previous 3 championship appearances. The more so for me was the relationship he had with Ashley Barnes, which almost felt like it was almost a telepathic thing that emerged. I mean, I remember going right back to in terms of publicly, and you could even see then the understanding of space and awareness of where each needed to be on the pitch and the roles within that dynamic. And that's just continued on when the real business started. So, of course, if you disrupt that by taking Josh Sargent out of the equation, Adam Eder isn't a like-for-like player. His game isn't built on the same tenets. Both very physically powerful athletes, but one wants to stretch the play a little bit more. Adam Eder always wants to sort of drop in a bit deeper, and then maybe if I was looking at the two. I think of the two, Sargent is better in open play. I think Eder inside the box. We've seen that, or we've seen it this season again. Inside the box, if he gets the right service, he will score goals. He has that striker's instinct. But I just think outside the box, certainly in the demands that Wagner wants on his forward and attacking minded players, he's not quite the same type of template or profile as Josh Sargent. That is a factor, and they'll have to work through that. And of course, into that equation now comes the Forest lad they brought in, Wang. So, we'll discover what he can add to the party. But the other point I think is relevant as well, because I don't think it was simply Josh Sargent goes out, Adam Eder comes in, the performance level in the first half drops markedly up. And I've seen, and I thought it was a very fair point to make by somebody on social media earlier today that was the 3rd away game in a week, and the travel involved, I think they'd calculated 1,000 miles, Huddersfield and back, Bristol and back, and then obviously, culminating with Rotherham and back. And I know that doesn't apply to the whole squad, the likes of Angus and Ben Gibson and Kenny McLean missed out at Bristol, but the majority of that squad, they've done a lot of miles, a lot of travelling. And yes, they're professional athletes. They have that elite sports science and recovery network around them, but still, it's not conducive to retaining the freshness and the intensity that you need, particularly when you come up against the Rotherham team who were really on it in that regard in terms of the athleticism, the power, the energy, the intensity, the almost maniacal way they sort of set up camp in the Norwich half in that first half and really wanted to play the game in that part of the pitch. I think that was a factor, inevitably. But, that said, David Wagner, in one of his answers post-match, he wanted to downplay that. Now, maybe that was for public consumption, but, privately he would accept, as I think it is fair to accept that, the 3rd away game with all that travel, you probably are going to find a dip in terms of performance level, athletic performance. But, he made the point that, well, the second half was where they needed to be. So you can't really say it was a freshness factor. There was maybe just a sluggishness. But, it's not only the physical element. Mentally, the edge might have just been slightly off because it was the end of quite a congested period of away games and away travel. But so for me, yeah, I would tend to agree. I don't think it's necessarily all on Adam Eder, because that wouldn't be fair in the slightest, really. Why they were so off it in that first half. It's a factor. And now another positive for me that David and his coaching staff have 2 weeks freed from the game cycle to really think about that and the tactical elements of what was wrong in that performance in the first half, and focusing in on the forward areas of the pitch and that platform that they've hitherto had with Sargent and Barnes that they didn't have in the first half with Eder and Barnes, and how they get past that, because they're going to have to get past it. They're going to have to come up with a process in terms of the top end of the pitch and the structure with the ball that doesn't rely on just Sargent for the foreseeable, sadly. But also, I think, it wouldn't be fair not to point out that, maybe there was a factor of mental and physical fatigue is probably a bit too strong, but certainly that edge wasn't there in the first half. And that might have, I think, helped them to counteract, because we did see glimpses, even in the first half, when they were able. There was their best move for me of the entire game was Gabby Zara and Jack Stacey in Norwich's right back area, managed to break the press. I think Rowe was involved. I think Barnes was involved. I think Yanulis was the final overlapping run on the opposite side. Ball gets cut back. Zara 8 yards out. With his quality, he has to hit the target. And there was one or two other moments. Adam Eder got himself in a good advanced position. Jack Stacey, Fashnakt. They were able still to do it. It was just comparably to previous games on a much smaller sample. And I think, for me, inevitably, you do have to look at, maybe there was a lot of miles on the clock physically and mentally this past week, and certainly that will be taken off the table when Stoke roll into town 2 weeks hence, because they allowing for some international commitments. The vast majority of that group of players do now have 2 weeks to recharge mentally and physically. And when Stoke, as I say, come to Carrow Road, when we return to the Championship, that simply won't be an issue. So then we can hone in on the tactical elements of how David and his coaches go about, putting something in place that is as effective as it was hitherto, but without Josh Jarden.
Yeah, agreed. It's interesting. We both referenced those chats that we had individually with you, obviously with Wagner, and me with Garn, and that neither of them said it explicitly, but there was a reference to, I don't know if complacency is the right word, but certainly the attitude and approach to this game, given how much has been put into the squad in terms of that hope to inject it full of personality and experience and mentality. And we know, similarly, I guess, to Jurgen Klopp, we know Wagner is very much a disciple. Is this kind of mentality monster approach to his teams. Is there a concern's very strong, but is it something that we need to note as maybe like a blemish on the record so far? Because all of that has been discussed very positively thus far. The fact that first half performance came, and both of those people are talking a little bit, again, didn't ever use specifically the word complacency, but there was an alluding to it. Is that something, again, I don't want to use concern, because I think that disregards the context of this being one game out of a very, very good start. But is that something to note moving forward? That's something that they have to try and nip in the bud, isn't it? And I guess it's proof that for all of the progress that they've made, there's still probably some evolution to get to the stage that they need to be in from a mental aspect with this group.
Absolutely, yeah. And for me, that's implicit in David Wagner using the phrase reality check. Whatever you think you've done, or however good you think you are, or whatever you think you're set to do this season, if you pitch up at Rotherham and you show them, even if it was on a subconscious level, but if you show them any disrespect, and that, that was I think I'm right in saying that was their first win of the season. So if you're looking at it and thinking, well, we just need to, turn up here and do what we've done hitherto, and we'll walk away with 3 points and probably another bag full of goals and maybe even a clean sheet if we've really performed. If there was a trace of that, then yes, hopefully that is a very pertinent reminder. And as David said, in his opinion, that wasn't anything Rotherham particularly did outstandingly well. That was more the shortcomings in his own team and his own team's performance. And if he sees that again, then I think there will be a very strong reaction, because for me, to repeat what I said at the outset, that did have an echo of that decline, that sad, slow trudge into mid-table last season, when I don't even think that wasn't a complacency thing. That was just like they were shot. The confidence had drained out of that group. Yes, there was injuries to senior players in key areas of the pitch, and the players who were coming in were not either A, good enough, or B, ready in terms of some of the younger players. And it was an amalgam of things, but it was a toxic mix, and the proof was in one win in 11. So yeah, I mean, any sense that you were on the precipice of a similar cycle, then I'm not surprised that maybe that's why maybe Wagner and Gunn, internally and externally, were quite keen to message it in a way that no, that isn't good enough. That's not where this group are this season. Our standards are higher. The demands they place on each other, not just David Wagner on those players or David and his coaches on those players. There's a lot of senior lads in there. I've seen Ashley Barnes on social media since the game. Not good enough. They need to get back to the drawing board a little bit, work hard over these 2 weeks, and attack Stoke and Leicester the other side with the relish and the energy and the intensity that we saw. Southampton, Hull. You can list them all. Huddersfield. Huddersfield away and Rotherham away, for me, bracketed in terms of similar challenges. Two very uncompromising teams with a brand of football that you know what it is. It's a physical challenge. You have to stand up to that. You have to win your battles, and if you do, then you hope your quality comes through. And what was the difference between Huddersfield and Rotherham? It wasn't just Josh Sargent's omission. I think it was a general sense that that group of players, individually and collectively, below par. I mean, he's in the picture behind me now, and I'm not singling him out particularly, but Gabby Zara, nowhere near the levels we've seen hitherto in terms of his influence and his quality. But you could go from front to back, the centre-backs and the full-backs, even Johnny Rowe, from the high point he's been at, I don't think he got anywhere near his level. So there was a general weariness, maybe, and I say as I say that, again, my mind does go back to, and it's not an excuse. You're not trying to give them cheap get out, but if you've gone Huddersfield away, you've gone Bristol away, and then you complete your week with Rotherham away, and particularly the nature of the Huddersfield game, even though Norwich run out comfortable winners, that was a physically demanding game. Bristol City, in its own way, there was a lot of effort expended in that game as well, and then you roll it on, and of course it's very difficult as well. Tones are set early on in games, aren't they? How games develop a lot of the time is a byproduct of those first 15, 20 minutes, the good start, cliche soundbite. And when you find yourself 2-0 down before half time and you've not played well, that's a hell of a mountain to climb, even against a team who first win of the season. And I think we'd all expect them to be, their mission is to stay in the division. So they will be at the wrong end of the table, you would expect. But even then, if you in the Championship, you give a team like that a 2-goal head start, then it's going to take something to really overhaul that. So, yeah, I think ultimately for me, too many players were below the levels we know they're capable of, and that's where the frustration comes now. That what we saw from Norwich yesterday is not the sum total of what this group can produce. They're far better than that individually and collectively. And if there was any complacency or any sense of entitlement, then maybe to get this type of afternoon so early in the season, it's certainly not a damaging defeat in terms of the bigger picture. And if it has the desired effect and they come out the traps fast against Stoke and Leicester thereafter, and those two performances at Carrow Road are more akin to what we saw in the previous 6 games, then we can bracket this one as a bit of a blip and a bit of a reminder that where Norwich want to get to this season, they're going to have plenty more afternoons where they go to teams like Rotherham, like Huddersfield the previous weekend, and they dig in and they roll their sleeves up metaphorically and collectively and figuratively, and they get back on the coach where they might not have played well, it might not have been pretty, but they get on the coach with a point or 3, and teams who get promoted are able to do that.
Yeah, and that I think is where and this is going to be a funny expression, but where the optimism comes from this defeat, because you've got people talking about what they didn't do rather than perhaps what their opponents. And again, I want to stress Rotherham deserve to win the game. They were very, very good in that first half. But from a Norwich perspective, they're left reflecting on the stuff that they didn't do. And obviously the strike from Dexter Lambisca to open the scoring is an unbelievable strike. But I know Norwich will nitpick, for example, what they didn't do to deal with the long throw initially. Jordan Hugill header as well. They got overloaded in a pretty simple throw-in situation, and obviously Hugill gets above Duffy for the cross. So there will be elements within that. They'll look at what they didn't do. And again, I think even on the very low level of basics, you had too many players making too many simplistic errors, even to the likes of Gabriel Sara, who we've raved about for a long, long time, even amidst that kind of 1 in 11 run towards the back end of last season, because he has constant quality. He does the basics well. His first touch is always good. His passing is always good, particularly over a short range. Wasn't quite there yesterday. Just everything quite felt a little bit off. And when you have 5 or 6 players all experiencing that kind of situation and performance level, it's very hard at any level then to win a game of football. Norwich did it very well last week, where they scored 2 goals in a moment where the game was really in balance, and it won it for them. And this weekend, Rotherham probably did the same, and they were on the other end of that. They got caught on the chin pretty early and were left kind of stumbling around all afternoon. And in the second half, they tried to throw a couple of wild punches, but just couldn't quite land them in the way that they would like to. And I think, as well, I think it's very important, because it's easy after a defeat to be very reactive to a result and to be very reactive to a performance. But across a 46 game season, you're going to have games where teams a team doesn't perform very well. Norwich won't perform very well, and they will lose games, and they will lose a few games this season. What they need to ensure that this is one of a few games that they lose, and it then becomes about the response, because very, very quickly, if you get to the other side of the international break and you stumble against Stoke and you lose to Leicester and you go to Plymouth and you struggle, then suddenly people are going to begin to talk about, we're probably going to raise them as well. Has the bubble burst? Has this been have we kind of all been hoodwinked by a really poor start? So in many ways, this type of wake-up call can be really good. It can focus minds. It can keep those standards high. But I also think, and again, I'm going to use the Daniel Farkerism, it's important not to get that deep with it. They've lost a game. Every team in this Leicester, I think every team in the league now has lost a game. It happens, and it's just going to be about now how they respond to it. One point I did want to make, Pat, before we move on to the transfer window was the second half, because they were much improved. And actually, for as much as we've spoken about Adam Ida, and that's obviously with the context of Josh Sargent, I don't want it to feel like we're singling out Adam Ida, because we're not. We could easily speak about Dimi Yanulis, who, when he has a poor game, has a really poor game increasingly at Norwich City. Jack Stacey, both of those players have been really good at the start of the season. Both really struggled yesterday. We've already mentioned Gabriel Sara, who didn't have his best games. Ashley Barnes, I felt, for all of the praise that we gave him last week, just wasn't really that effective this weekend for the reasons that we've discussed. Duffy and Gibson were left kind of looking at each other for Jordan Hugill's goal. So we've probably gone through 10 of 11 players there. I haven't mentioned Kenny McLean. I thought he was okay actually throughout the whole piece, but. So again, I didn't want to make it feel like we're singling that out. But the point I did want to make in that second half, Pad, was the squad and where the squad is at the moment. It's a very young bench that David Wagner could name. Obviously impacted slightly by Andrew Omobamidele leaving very late. He was planned to be in the matchday squad. He wasn't. We'll come on to him and his departure soon. But they've also got obviously Borja Sainz to come back. They've got Jakob Sørensen to come back. Whether you think he's a frontline option or not, he would, I think, occupy a space on the bench. Onel Hernandez as well, similarly. Obviously now Yuzhou Huang and Danny Bart as well. That's 6 players there that we've counted that aren't in this matchday squad. Adam Forshaw, there's a 7th. So there's a long list of players who weren't at the New York Stadium that probably could have helped David Wagner and Norwich change the game a little bit more than they did. They didn't have a striker on the bench, for example, a recognised one. They had to turn to Tony Springett, who's played a very limited amount of football. Shemiswaf Poeta, who has played a very limited amount of football over the last 12 months. And obviously, I know he impressed at Bristol City the other night, but that's quite a big load for where he's at in terms of his individual season as well. And there is mitigation in terms of the squad that Norwich City took. They had Callum Fisher, Jayden Warner. It was a very, very young bench is the point I'm getting at. And it felt like maybe the options that they had to alter the course of that game and the dynamic of that game maybe weren't of the same level as they've had in recent weeks, where you've had players like Adam Eder coming off the bench and impacting it from a positive perspective. So is this game also, and you mentioned kind of the week that they've had in terms of travel, is it also a reflection that they were probably, just in terms of depth for this occasion, just a little bit off where they perhaps will be after the break as well?
Yeah, and that's the opposite, I think, because in that 6-game unbeaten run, because they've got that depth and 9 obviously permissible substitutes allowed now in your match day squad, they have been able to change it, and David has talked up that ability. Adam Eder, opening day of the season, comes off the bench, 96-minute winner. Fashnak came off the bench, scored at Southampton. I'm sure there's one or two other examples, if I could stop and think about them, where. And I thought Poeta actually yesterday, despite very limited options, I thought there was a few balls he put into the box that he did continue on in the same vein from his Bristol performance. I thought he added something to the mix, and but that was, that probably underlined the point that we're talking about. A guy who's been out most of last season, really, who's still very much handled with care in terms of bringing him back up to the load that you could put on him, and he was the only one really who could even nudge the dial in terms of going and trying to get a goal and get back into that game. And obviously Hwang will add, if we're just focusing in on the post Sargent kind of mix to the forward areas. We thought maybe even in the first half yesterday you could have, because he looked quite effective in that role at Bristol, you could have thrown Gibbs on and maybe pushed Sargent further forward. That might have given them a bit more of a platform. It certainly would have stretched the play and just another good quality technical player. We didn't reference Marcelino Nunes, of course. He was available yesterday, wasn't he? And didn't come on. And he was very good, I thought, in that quarterback role in the second half at Bristol, and he triggered the move that led to Poeta's winner in that League Cup game. So yes, when you look at it and you're looking at probably a dearth of game-changing options on the bench yesterday, that might cause a little palpitation or a little tremor amongst Norwich's fan base. But I think when we get to the other side of this break, and David did give us an update that Hernandez with a broken hand, he'll be back in training. Science, who I think could be the kingmaker in this equation in terms of another attacking option to throw into the mix, he might be a little bit longer. It sounds like they need to put him on a track that Forshaw's currently on, where both of those haven't had a pre-season worth of the name, and they need to get an abbreviated one in now, which will include minutes for 21s. Forshaw played 45 minutes on Saturday morning. I think if there's an upcoming game over this fortnight's period, he would feature there, possibly Science as well. So it's not going to be immediately the other side of this international break that we can really put Forshaw forward and Science forward as frontline options. Onel hopefully will be in that bracket, but it shouldn't be too far after that point. And I think that will then, with Gibbs, with Nunes, with Poeta, just allow them a little bit more wriggle room that wasn't probably available for Saturday's game. And obviously, again, we're talking about factors as to why they've been so far off it, and that sense as well that maybe there was players there who, in an ideal world, David would have liked to have rotate a little bit and inject some freshness from the bench, and that wasn't really a viable option, bar maybe Nunes. He I did think we might see in the second half, but David decided not to go that route. But if this is a broader sort of look at the squad depth and a fear that they're going to be caught out, then nobody knows in terms of the injury situation. But it feels like they do have enough options for me when everybody, or the majority of everybody in the group, are available, and they clearly felt that in terms of their squad construction over this transfer window, which closed on Friday. Otherwise, they'd have gone out again. They allowed a player like Abu Kamara, who got his first career goal for Portsmouth on Saturday. He's gone out to Portsmouth League One loan. There is a recall option there. David Wagner was very keen to insert one of those. So that's not in the here and now, but should they need to find a more forward-thinking option, he's a player they could recall. And other than that, then for me, it's going to have to come from the players who are now in the building and between now and January. And I don't have any concerns that there's a lack of squad depth here for me. I just think it was a fairly unique set of circumstances, both with the disruption from Friday night and the transfer window, and obviously the Sargent injury as well. But I think once we get to the other side of the international break, touch wood, I think City squad depth won't be something we'll be concerned about as we roll into Christmas period.
Yeah, I concur for the reasons mapped out, and I think that was just important to highlight. A couple of other things to mention as well. Angus Gunn made his 100th appearance for Norwich City. I think I read a stat, and again, I think it was from NCFC numbers, saying that him and Brian, obviously his dad, are the first father-son duo to do that. So that's a lovely achievement, and he spoke glowingly about that. Obviously a boyhood Norwich fan, so the opportunity to do it, and he's taken a bit of the scenic route. He obviously left at a young age when he was in the academy to join Manchester City, came back on loan, left again, came back again. So he's taken the scenic route to 100 games, but nonetheless a very dependable and I think, obviously very prominent now goalkeeping option for Norwich City. Gabriel Sara made his 50th as well, and even after this game, it made me laugh. I was speaking just before I fit in between kind of the press conferences and film my verdict. I was speaking to someone who covers Rotherham every week, and they were still singing Gabriel Sara's praises. Oh, what a player he is! And I had to remind them that's probably about as bad as he's played in a Norwich City shirt for a significant period of time. So that's an interesting reminder, as well as maybe to the quality that he has even on an off day. And I think we saw a bit more of that in the second half as well. So two things to highlight. Let's move on to deadline day then, Paddy, because I must admit, when I woke up on Friday morning, I wasn't quite. I had a feeling it would go late. I didn't have a feeling it would go as late as it did. Norwich City took until 1:30 to conclude their business in a very frenetic close to the window, which is uncharacteristic, really, from the way that they've operated since Stuart Webber came in charge. And we have to say it wasn't a situation where it was because they felt they had missing pieces that they were chasing. It was obviously reacting to a Josh Sargent injury, which David Wagner has confirmed is going to put him out likely until January, and he's going to have surgery on Monday, which is about as bad an outcome, I think, as anybody anticipated for him. And we obviously wish him well and hope the surgery goes well. He's been such, as we mentioned, a key cog to what Norwich City have been doing, yes, but it's also a real blow for him, somebody who's had to wait a significant portion of time to get that opening and that opportunity to lead the line for Norwich City. Had a lot of frustration at obviously having to do different jobs, play out wide in a really struggling team, which isn't the role necessarily that he wanted to play. It was a big opportunity for him. He took the number 9 shirt. To now miss a significant portion of the season with an injury is not ideal. He did a podcast as well, just to clarify this point, to which cleared up that it wasn't actually the contact with Lee Nichols and kind of that post impact after heading the ball in that caused the injury. It was actually the initial block. So anyone who's maybe rushed to blame Lee Nichols for that injury, it was good to hear Josh Sargent clear up exactly how that happened, but nonetheless a significant blow for Norwich City. So that meant they headed into deadline day as it stood then, trying to sign a striker on loan. They'd obviously been linked with Tom Cannon, was the main one, although even though he was a player of interest, there was never a £7 million bid for him, and anyone with any sort of grasp on Norwich City's finances would understand why that wasn't the case. There was a couple of loose striking links before that, and then began deadline day with a link to Kiefer Moore, and then all hell broke loose, Paddy, on how it went. But they ended up obviously then having to react to Andrew Omobamidele, which is where I want to start this, because someone said to me on Friday morning, who knows about these things, that keep an eye on that situation. That could be one that the touch paper is lit and it could explode. And goodness me, they were right, Paddy, because it was a very, very late deal, a very, very late agreement that was struck, to the extent that Andrew Omobamidele was actually in Rotherham. It's got a bit of the Lewis Grabban about it, but probably a better side for Norwich City. I don't know what it is about Rotherham and hotels in Rotherham, but there you go. And he obviously embarked on a very quick dash to Nottingham to complete a medical, but it started off the day with Bournemouth, from what we were led to believe, kind of sniffing around. They were obviously preparing if Lloyd Kelly departed. I think there was interest from Tottenham, wasn't there? Nottingham Forest at that stage were trying to keep options warm. I think they're in for Trevor Chalobah, if reports are to be believed, and ended up with Andrew Omobamidele. Just talk me through how that all played out, Paddy, because we obviously had a bit more information subsequently on the process that led from perhaps that Friday morning where Nottingham Forest were there and they were making pretty derisory offers for Andrew Omobamidele, to the point where he leaves Norwich City as somebody who could being the word, with add-ons and various aspects of the deal, become a £20 million departure for the football club. It's quite a step to make in what was just a few hours.
Yes, yeah, and it was a few hours, but I mean, there was some telling pictures taken by our photographer who was getting very excited, Paul Chesterton, after the Bristol midweek game where Omobamidele played.
I've never seen. Just to interrupt. I was waiting to go into the mix zone, and I've never seen our photographer Paul Chesterton stood outside one, desperate to relay the information. I hadn't actually seen it in real time, but worth saying, he was absolutely spot on, wasn't he?
He certainly was. Well, he's
as he always is.
As he always is, PC. But and I said, well, if you haven't seen the frames, it's essentially, it looked like the long goodbye, almost an emotional kind of motion to peel off from the rest of the teammates at the final whistle, celebrating with the away fans, and just have his own private moment, really. And they were reciprocating; they were singing his name, and I think PC even said when he got back towards the sort of the tunnel area at Ashton Gate, there seemed to be one or two backroom staff, but sort of hugging him, patting him. But I think that's pretty par for the course with players when they come off. They always sort of form one of those little mini guards of honour. So I mean, funny enough, on the night, spoke to somebody who would know about these things inside the club, and they say, well, if he's off, then nobody's told us yet. So. But as the nature of these things, there's so many planets getting circled and things that could happen, and you've mapped it out. Then if you roll it on to Friday, it was, it's just popped into my head actually, a phrase that David Wagner came out with earlier in the summer about more so when will Norwich go again after that initial flurry when they brought in Barnes and brought in Stacey and brought in Shane Duffy. But there'd been a lull then, and he came out with that rather prosaic phrase about, we're just waiting for a stone or two to fall, and then all the other stones will fall. Well, that to me was it felt like where we were with Omobamidele, that there were clubs out there, Bournemouth, you mentioned, Forest, who turned out to be the suitor of choice. But, even you look at Fulham, who there was a lot of chatter around Adebayo and whether he would depart, and then if he did, they'd be looking for a similar profile of centre-back. Palace and Mark Guehi, he was persistently linked with outs. So it felt like, because of the finality of deadline and that's it and nothing more can be done, that it might go late with Andrew, but probably not. We didn't feel as late to the extent, as you rightly say, Connor. He was with the group at Rotherham to be part of the squad for Saturday's game, but he had to swiftly head to the East Midlands. As you rightly say, it would appear that the early contact between the likes of Stuart Webber and his counterparts was around figures that were simply not going to be acceptable to Norwich. Below 5 million is what we're led to believe when it started on Friday morning, the discussions of a substantive nature, should we say. So it's progressed throughout the day to the point where it's hit the numbers, and David Wagner confirmed that afterwards. It got to a very, very good offer that, from a footballing perspective and a financial perspective, he felt made sense. And they're always making these decisions in terms of what's good, what's the best thing for the club, in the best interest of the football club. And they felt a potential 20 million package. There's a bit of conjecture about, what's up front, but from what we're led to believe, it was the structure of that deal is more favourable in terms of what Norwich will get up front. There, it isn't packed with a back end load of attendant clauses. That both the figures and the structure of the deal got to a point where Norwich felt, yep, that's where we feel the valuation of Andrew is, and of course then it moves to the player and his representatives. David has confirmed after the game, of course, he was, as you would expect, very keen to get back to the Premier League and explore that opportunity. So it's a win-win for all three parties, really, because Forest are talking him up as one of the best defensive prospects in the country. That remains to be seen. I think we discussed this on our pre-match show at Rotherham, that yes, there is a potential there, but it is very much potential, and injuries primarily have really stalled his development for me in the last 2 seasons. From the player who first burst on the scene, who then got himself into the Island senior setup, and you just thought, wow, this guy has got everything physically, but his ability on the ball and the sky is proverbially the limit. Hasn't quite happened for him, but Forest clearly feel under the guidance of Steve Cooper there that they can mould him into a real good Premier League defender, and you hope that is the case, because if it is, then those clauses that would take the deal potentially up to 20 million will probably get hit. So from Norwich's perspective now, you want him to go on and flourish and realise that potential at Premier League level, and then who knows where he goes on to from there, because there is a very highly capable defender for me, I think, but in the right here and right now, I think it's very much the right move for Norwich. I think financially it makes perfect sense, given Norwich's difficulties that have been mapped out clearly for anybody who's still in debating. They've got money in for Omar Daly, they've got money in for Max Aarons, they've got money in for Rashica, they got a top up from James Maddison's move as well. Why haven't they gone out and lavished that on players to bring into the club? Go and look at the last set of accounts. They were borrowing money against future revenue, 2 pillars: broadcast revenue, but also player sales, player trading, which is a key pillar of the Weber model that has been put in place in 2017. And it's probably because they haven't had those big ticket sales, a Ben Godfrey, a Maddison, a Buendia in the recent windows, that has probably got them to this financially constrained position whereby they had to generate revenue. It's simple as that. So, but also added to that, and this is where I think David was coming from, the footballing dimension. He started the season second fiddle to Messrs Gibson and Duffy. So it's not even you're taking a player who was crucially important to Norwich in that unbeaten run in the side. So, with the addition of Danny Bart, with Grant Hanley hopefully closing in on a return as we get to the end of the year, the turn of the new year, they feel that by selling Andrew, the financial element of the equation makes sense, but also footballing wise, it's not going to, in David's view, and his is the view that matters, it's going to dramatically weaken Norwich in terms of central defensive options. Time will tell on that, of course, but once Forest hit the numbers, then that deal was always going to get made. But they still needed, obviously, the deal sheet had to go in, that mechanism which gave them an extra 2 hours to get the deal. And I'll bowl it back to you, Connor, as you was driving our coverage along with Sam. I mean, you then had to burn the midnight oil into the early hours of Saturday. Not ideal when you've got a trip to Rotherham a few hours later, but that's how late it went. And then the knock-on effect, which we found out a little bit more about at Rotherham, the Danny Bart deal was literally seconds from not getting done. That Norwich had to get an extension of a smaller nature. I think it was to 11:15. Yeah. The deadline was 11 in terms of getting business done, unless you was doing a Premier League move, which was on with Bama Daly, and you get the deal sheet in, and that gave you another 2 hours. But the extension period for an EFL transfer, as it was, a free transfer in Bart's case, was 11:15, and that was very tight, to the point where we've been told that, even at 11:30 or so, Danny Bart is having to be phoned up and sort of given the news that deal's gone through and that it's been ratified by the FA and that he is now officially a Norwich player, and he could then travel to Rotherham, and he was in the director's box watching the game on Saturday. So, there was more than an element of seat of the pants stuff, and you obviously drove our coverage there, Connor. I mean, just give us a perspective of what that period from, we'll get into the Wang dimension, but certainly the Bama Daly dimension, it was kind of nine onwards, and then it was almost carnage, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. It was, and I think for me the worst bit was between 11, so when the window had officially closed, and probably about 12:15, where you're trying to speak to people and ask people what's going on, and no one really had a clue if anything had gone through. If it wasn't, there was a confidence that it had, but nobody could definitively say that it had. And so you had this real line. And for me, I was sat there thinking, goodness, if this has all fallen through, the ramifications for Norwich City were going to be huge. They would have lost out on a massive fee for Omar Deli, which I think would have gone through regardless if Bart hadn't have gone through. But to have lost the Danny Bart deal at that stage would have been, from a PR perspective, pretty catastrophic. You'd be a centre half light, really, and we all know Norwich fans have kind of been wanting another one on top, really, of Omar Deli and obviously now Bart. it would have left them really short. So it was, yeah, the hour between the deadline closing and then officially getting the message that it was all done and they were in a position now to kind of announce stuff. And as I said, it was Omobamidele at 1, Barca 1:15, and Hwang at 1:30. That's how late it went. I think the last time I looked at my phone on Saturday morning, as it was 1:49, I think, before I eventually got my head down, having set up the live blog, I think before 7 o'clock. So that gives you in the morning. So that gives you AM. So that gives you an indication of just how long that day went. And I remember I put out a tweet on the PinkUn account, and it read something like, Norwich City are in store for a busy deadline day. And it got to about 4 o'clock, and I think a few people on social media had spotted they hadn't been particularly busy at that stage. But I can assure you, behind the scenes, it was it's like a duck, isn't it? Like everything looks calm above surface, but underneath it's frantically kicking its legs. It was a little bit like that. And obviously the Omobamidele stuff materialized, and that was very late. I think the first time that I think it was about 7 where it began to feel like something was happening, and about 9 o'clock where it was definitively wheels are in motion, full steam ahead, everything was going. So that gives you an indication of how late that went. And then I think the time kind of we got wind of Danny Bart, that was about, I think, 43 minutes left to go in the window by the time that we put that story out there. So gives you an indication of how close it was. Danny Bart's a really interesting one. He's made 300 championship appearances. He's someone that Stuart Webber knows well from Wolves, Paul Clements, the goalkeeping coach. Likewise, we're told he was someone who featured on the list of centre-back options that they've been doing a lot of work on. And I would imagine one of the scenario plannings that the recruitment team did was this eventuality that it could likely go very, very late. And then it became about assessing which options on the list were doable in the quickest period of time. And that was Danny Bart. So that's why that probably elevated him to the list. It's obviously a 1-year deal with the option of an extra year. I think that gives Norwich some protection in that it doesn't block the pathway of young centre-backs like Adeboyega, in the under-21s, who's been really impressing. Jayden Warner as well, who was on the bench. Jonathan Tompkinson, who was still waiting to hear whether his move to Bradford City has gone through. And I think Norwich City from their end are waiting on a few bits at the Bradford end to try and confirm whether or not that's the case. So you've got a kind of a short-term option, but in the long term, it shouldn't be. It's not like they've given him a 4-year deal and he's going to be kind of sat in someone's spot for the next for the foreseeable future. Someone who will offer real cover. He fits the profile of what they've been trying to do from a recruitment perspective as well. So that covers off the Omobamidele Bart stuff. Just very quickly, Paddy, on Hwang. I think by our own admission, he's not a player that we know too much about. I think we're both really intrigued to see him. But I guess the point to reiterate here is that we've been told by multiple people actually that he's one that when they compiled a list of players that they wanted to replace Josh Sargent, it was obviously very quickly formed. There was Kiefer Moore was on it, Jamal Lowe we know was on it. There was a young lad at Wolves who featured on it. But at the very top was Yujo Hwang. That is someone, a profile of player, the type of player, an intelligent presser from what we're led to believe. Someone I don't think who's necessarily that quick, but someone who they feel has been recruited for David Wagner's style, for this system in mind. How intrigued are you by this? 31-year-old South Korean, really, really interesting career. He's played in France. He's played in Greece. He's not yet played a game competitively in England. A lot of his football in South Korea. He becomes Norwich's first South Korean player. I did say their first Asian in the team video, but someone was quick to remind me that Zesh Rahman, I think, was a Pakistan international. So he has that crown. So I think he's the second Asian to play for Norwich City. What do you make of this deal and how it all came about?
Well, yeah, I mean, just to add to everything you've mapped out there, it was very clear because if I go back and it feels like a lot longer, but I only go back to last Saturday and post-match Huddersfield, and the nature of that in terms of the media was we didn't do a formal down to Colney presser for the Bristol game, which was then the following Tuesday, the League Cup game. We did our post-match.
You're in a corridor.
Well, yeah. I was just building up to that. I was building up the excitement.
Sorry.
The setting, but I mean, I'm sure people have watched that video. But essentially, it was Huddersfield have their formal press conference setting where we did reflections on that 4-0 win and all the good news around that. and then myself, Sam, and David Wagner, and Norwich's head of comms departed to outside of that door because I think Neil Warnock was coming through, and we certainly wasn't going to hold him up by talking about Bristol City. Can you imagine that? I'd have been on some viral clip. Who the hell are you? Sort of vibe. But anyway, so we were basically ensconced. Yeah. We were ensconced in a corridor, which was, I think anybody's watched the footage. It's on the PinkUn YouTube channel. It's quite amusing to see which Norwich player next comes down the corridor. I think Duffy came down, and Ida, and wasn't quite sure whether they should be shuffling past the manager.
You nearly ended up on the team coach, didn't you?
Not far off. I was going to help with the crates at one point, because the payoff to that story is that once we finished with David and he departed, we couldn't get back into the main room because that door was locked now because Warnock was holding court, and they clearly didn't want us barging in. And we must have been there for 10 or 15 minutes, and it was right the entrance to where the team coach was. So yeah, I mean, we could have gone out there and got abused by the Norwich fans, but we decided no, we'd stay in the confines of the corridor around the corner. But long-winded anecdote, which probably has not served a purpose, that it was supposed to be meant as an entertainment aside to behind the scenes. But essentially, David, at that point, Saturday evening, clearly Josh Sargent, nobody's fully aware of the extent he's going to be out. He was more of a mind to, well, we've got options, within the group, existing options. Adam Eder had scored, Ashley Barnes had scored, Liam Gibbs, he referenced, could play in that more advanced role, and then we subsequently saw that at Bristol actually in the following game. Nunes as well, and very much he was of a mind that we probably won't do anything. But as the hours and then the days have transpired, and further assessment of Josh, medical assessment, and then culminating in obviously, on the Friday of the week, we've just finished. He's down in London where he has it confirmed that he needs surgery. I don't think the timeline has changed. I think it was very clear early on last week that this is a long one. This is a serious injury. And at that point, as David said to me yesterday, 4 months, he hadn't totted up, but it's a hell of a lot of games in terms of Josh Sargent's unavailability. If you remember, and it was pertinent because they came up against Jordan Hugill on Saturday, when he let Jordan Hugill go, he said, look, I like to work with 3 strikers. That's the number I like. 2, basically, in my match day squad, and then 1 who's, pushing the other 2. And in his mind, that was, at that point, obviously, it was Timu, and it was Josh, and it was Adam. Then Ashley Barnes comes in and replaces Timu in that dynamic. But of course, if Josh is out for the foreseeable and you're left with Adam Eder and Ashley Barnes, that doesn't fit the criteria of how David likes to work with his striker options. So, it very quickly then turned to, can they financially do something? Yes, they could. And then, as you've mapped out, Connor, a list was drawn up. I mean, the Tom Cannon 7 million, that was #circus, very much so. There was never going to be any prospect that Norwich were going to be spending 7 million or anything remotely approaching 7 million on a striker, because, as I say, before they kicked off against Huddersfield, there was no striker strand to the remaining days of the window. It was very much Sargent, Eder, Barnes. That's the way it's going to be. But unfortunately, events, dear boy events, that phrase, and they have had to react, and they've had to go back into the market at a very late time, relatively, and look at the viable options. And yes, as we're led to believe now, subsequently, while there was, plates being spun with those other names you've referenced, Wang was the one they felt had a lot of the attributes that Josh Sargent possesses. And we started this conversation talking about maybe what Josh brings that Adam doesn't, in terms of the profile of striker and how important that is within the overall what David Wagner's trying to do with his team, and has done successfully in those first 6 League and Cup games. It would appear, and I'll confess, I haven't seen any of Wang in terms of footage of him, but David Wagner certainly has, and he feels that the pressing, the ability to stretch the play, just that work ethic, all the things you associate with a Josh Sargent type of game are in this player's game, and played at a good level in France. Hasn't had an opportunity in terms of Forest and Premier League yet, but a lot of caps for South Korea, one of the powerhouses of Asian football. I think it's safe to say he's now away with South Korea, although bizarrely, I think they're playing 2 games in England, one in Wales and one in England over this 2-week period. So he's not going to have to do too much travelling. But a pedigree of striker who you would feel would be able to come in and impact it in the way Ashley Barnes has done. So that's a really intriguing piece of business for me, to see what this guy can bring, albeit at Championship level rather than Premier League. You would hope with his pedigree and what he's done in his career that he would be able to come in and add something. And if he's got some of the pleasing aspects of the Josh Sargent type of striker to him, then I'm not saying he's going to completely soften the blow and deliver everything that Josh Sargent would have delivered potentially in this period between now and when he's fit and available again. But if he can offset to a degree, then you would hope that overall Norwich can continue to move forward in terms of where they're pitching their ambitions this season. And then if everything goes to plan, Josh Sargent is available for the second half of the season. But out of what was a pretty desperate situation for the player, for his teammates, and for Norwich generally, hopefully they've sourced a solution which can mitigate some of a feeling that the wheels could come off if they wasn't able to do something, because Barnes and Ida, I don't think would deliver what Josh Sargent would deliver in terms of that out and out focal point, the number 9, the big powerful presence who can run in behind athletically, can battle with defenders, and as he'd already shown, potentially could get you a goal every couple of games at Championship level.
Yeah, just finally, then let's have some reflections on the transfer window as a whole. We've kind of reached the equivalent of the final. A deal sheet's gone in on the podcast, so we've got a little bit of an extension to talk about the window a bit more generally. We kind of spoke earlier on about the finances and where Norwich City find themselves, and I don't think we've ever not spoken about that as I guess a pillar of the way that the transfer windows panned out. And I don't think you necessarily need to be an expert to see majority of their signings have been free signings beyond Christian Fashnak. He's the only senior player that they've paid a fee for this summer, and that was off the back of obviously losing Bali Mumba, and obviously probably some of the you mentioned the uplift they got from the James Maddison deal. Whether that any of that was put into that or not, we don't know. But predominantly from the money they received from Bali Mumba got that deal across the line. Otherwise, it was free transfers and obviously loans as well. So I think it's probably fair to say, if you're Stuart Webber, the remit he had at the end of last season was probably to raise funds for the reasons that we've spoken about in terms of the loans that they took out against future earnings, and obviously if they're promoted, that they'd then be taken out against the broadcast money that they got. But at the moment, it's having to be against future earnings. Obviously, lack of parachute payments as well. It was also probably to reduce costs, and I think the best way to see that is probably the decision to replace Tim Krul, who would have been on a fairly healthy sum in terms of wages with someone like George Long, but to go through that cost cutting process whilst adding, I guess, the minerals and all of those aspects, but also predominantly to make sure they still had a team that David Wagner could feel that he could be competitive with in the Championship. So if those kind of pillars that maybe were the objectives at the start of the transfer window, Pad, I don't know, you can grade it, you can rank it out of 10. I'll leave it up to you. How successful is, and obviously it's always the more time away from a transfer window can you look at it and assess it properly. But sat right here, right now, marking against those criteria that perhaps he had at the start of the window, how would you assess, how would you reflect on the summer of 2023 and Norwich's transfer business?
Well, I mean, if we were going to put a figure to it, I mean, and obviously we're coming off the back of a bit of a disappointing 90 minutes, but a 7 or 8, I think. I think it has been a good window for, as you say, the twin track approach almost of trying to improve the squad and making them far more competitive in terms of Championship aspirations, and also the financial element, which you mapped out there again. And on both measures, I think it's a big tick. And I mean, even in this picture behind me, keeping the number 17 for Norwich as well. Let's not underestimate that, because I'm sure if they'd have pushed hard and aggressively, and Zara and his people had done, then there was a deal to be made there. Stuart Webber said right at the outset of the summer, serious interest in that player, and that was before he was. He embellished his show reel with what he's done already in the early weeks of the Championship season. So, it's also about who they retained as well. I mean, ultimately, Rashica wasn't going to be part of it, wanted to go. They got him out the door. Max, likewise, we know from all sides that the time had come. And Omobama Daly, after the interest that was there in January, which Stuart confirmed at the end of last season, there was always a sense right from the start of the summer, and the fact that the planning was going into that in terms of the what-if scenarios, that he would depart as well. And as I said earlier on, hadn't dislodged Duffy or Gibson in terms of the Championship starting lineup. So they've let players go who were not materially impacting what they're trying to do on the pitch this season, yet they've generated some significant funds, I think it's safe to say. So time will tell, as you rightly say, Connor, whether in terms of the dimension of have they improved the squad. Well, that'll be apparent enough when we get to through into the season, and then ultimately where they finish come next May. I think they have. I think everybody feels they have on the evidence of the early weeks of the season. So, I think it's safe to say the squad is better than last season's squad, but how much better and how high the bar can be raised now, time will tell. But don't underestimate the financial constraints they were operating under this transfer window, because they're there in black and white in the last set of accounts. And ultimately, this next season or the season after is going to be very challenging, I think, in terms of the financial remit, particularly if they don't get promoted, because we're going to be back here again. And unfortunately, the player who is in that picture, if they don't go up, I don't see any realistic prospect of them keeping him this time next year. So we might have a similar cycle. The next few windows, if progress isn't where they need to get it to on the pitch in terms of promotion back to the Premier League, I think we may find that what we've just gone through in terms of the approach is where they're going to have to pitch their tent in windows to come. That on one level they'll want to obviously continually improve the squad or look to improve it, but on another level they will always have to look to how they can generate funds to offset the lack of revenue from not being in the Premier League. And that is really, it's frustrating, I guess, when you've gone through a window and you're having to sort of maybe deal a certain part of the window or the market in terms of free agents and being creative, like the Borja Science deal there, a player who had a relegation clause that got activated and they were able to do that deal. But that's kind of was where the success from Webber and Farker first time round was rooted in the creativity and accepting the hand you're dealt in terms of the finances, but then pulling rabbits out of hats in certain places of players that they could source, like Pookie and Buendia, and then where it went again. They haven't managed to replicate to that degree again, but that is the challenge. And ultimately, if it doesn't happen, then that's probably going to lead to a period where it's going to be more about generating funds and trying to develop. And you can see it now with Johnny Rowe principally, but developing more young talent to, in the shorter term, improve your first team, but in the mid to longer term, if you don't go back to the Premier League, we all know the model. It will be to sell to keep the club being a sustainable, self-funded entity, and that's the nature of it. And I don't think that should now be a surprise to any Norwich fan. You know what the model is. You know how it works. You know the pillars of the model, and the window we've just gone through, I think, is kind of where Norwich will be for the foreseeable, unless and until things click on the pitch and they get back to the promised land and all the attendant broadcast revenue that comes from that.
Correct. There we go. The deadline has passed for the podcast. That seems like an apt place to wrap it up. Thank you very much for watching or listening, however you consumed this podcast. And if you are an audio listener, just a reminder, you can, if you want to see our lovely faces on a Sunday morning after a trip to Rotherham and a long deadline day, that's available to you as well. Plenty more coverage and content to come throughout the international break. We've got some good stuff lined up, and I think you'll be probably hearing more from us very, very soon on certain stuff as well. So keep it locked to our channels for that. Paddy, thank you very much. Enjoy your international break. It'd be nice to get some sleep and catch up on all of that important stuff. And we'll see you again very soon.